Hello, welcome to this video on scenario and contingency planning.
In business, sometimes things don't always work out as planned. It's important that businesses anticipate or try their best to anticipate what might happen, what might unfold, and how they might react to it. And the moral of the story is that in business, always expect the unexpected. And in this video, we're going to look at some ways in which businesses might do that. We're going to look at what is meant by scenario planning, look at the typical risks a business might face and should consider, and then describe some ways in which businesses might reduce those risks or attempt to deal with those risks. So let's start off. What do we mean by risk? Well, from a business sense, we mean possibly the loss of possibly making a loss or perhaps damage to the business, a threat to the business that may hinder the ability of the business to achieve its objectives, or maybe that the chance that a hopeful outcome will not occur. So customers do not respond well to a new product launch, or a new investment in new piece of machinery doesn't work out with the productivity gains that we expected. All of these actions that a business might take, we would say, are characterized by risk. So risk is closely associated with change. Whenever a business goes through a process of change, there is risk. So how do businesses deal with risk? Well, one option might be just to ignore it and wait and see. A second option might be to try and reduce the probability of risk. A third option might be to share or deflect the risk. So, for example, taking out an insurance policy. Fourthly, make scenario plans and prepare for it. And lastly, treat risk as an opportunity. Particularly if it's affecting the whole industry, how can we take advantage of the risk and the change that is taking place? So we're going to look at number 4 there, which was scenario planning. And scenario planning is the process of identifying uncertainties that may affect the future of the business, and then putting in place procedures to deal with these events if they occur. So the first step would be to identify potential threats. What are the uncertainties, maybe internal within the business and external outside of the control of the business? Once we've done that, we can then brainstorm and simulate different scenarios. So what exactly would these threats, how would they appear if they were to actually happen? Then we can identify potential outcomes to each scenario. What would be the the final effect on the business of these scenarios unfolding? And how, importantly, how would we respond to those different scenarios? And once we've done that for all the threats, how they might turn out and how we might respond, we can then prioritize which are the most likely scenarios that we think are going to occur, and then we can implement and rehearse the procedures that we came up with to respond to those scenarios, so that if they do happen, the business is well prepared to respond in the ways that have been planned. So that's the process of scenario planning, and there's lots of different types of internal and external threat that businesses should be planning for, running scenarios, and for the most likely outcome or most likely scenarios, planning their approach and making sure it's part of how the business operates. An example of this might be an oil company like Shell. So they have very long-term investment plans. So it's important that they have some different scenarios of how things pan out and how that might affect their investments. So for example, over the decades, there have been different external threats that have impacted on their investments, and as part of their core business activities, they would have planned different scenarios. If there is a rise in environmental concerns linked to CO2, how is that going to affect our business? How would we respond? If there is a recession, how would that affect our business? How are we going to respond? So what the most likely scenarios at any given point in time, they'll be planning for those and rehearsing how they would respond. So we looked at scenario planning. Let's look at some of the typical risks a business might face. Well, there's lots of different risks potentially that a business could face at any moment in time, but we're going to pick out 3 key risks that we need to be aware of. And that is, first of all, natural disasters. So that can be very disruptive to supply chains, to For large international businesses, very much in a particular market, then that can be very disruptive. The second one is IT systems failures. Applies to nearly every business, but if you imagine if you lost access to all your email, your social media, your ordering systems, you personally, that would be quite a big um, negative impact on you, quite a big risk. If it happens for a business, even more so. So it's important that they consider that as a key risk: threat of cyber attacks, loss of data, no longer be able to function. And the final one is what happens if key staff leave. What happens if the chief executive gets another job somewhere else, and with them we lose our leadership, our vision, our goals, maybe some people with key skills within the business. If they leave, how are we going to deal with that risk? And that's what we're going to look at next, how businesses might reduce those risks. And any attempt by a business to reduce or eliminate risk we call risk mitigation. And that would normally be through a process of identifying what the risk is, assessing how significant that risk, and then prioritizing which risks should we be dealing with. And there are three areas in which businesses might look to mitigate risk. The first one is to ensure business continuity. The second one is succession planning. And the third one is contingency planning. So these are important key terms we get down on the next few slides. So first of all, what is meant by business continuity? Business continuity is when a business continues to operate following a period of disruption. So it's important that businesses plan and focus on the risks that might disrupt their activities. So can they ensure that the business continues to stay active? So for example, identifying alternative locations for production, perhaps, if struck by a natural disaster. Or perhaps making sure that they've got their data backed up in the event of an IT systems failure so that the business can continue. So that'd be one area of important risk mitigation. The second one is succession planning, and that is to do with the workforce and the key risk of what happens if staff leave. So this would be part of an HR strategy, and possibly what they could do is use work shadowing, where other members of staff follow the key member of staff to kind of learn about what they're doing, or maybe through a process of staff appraisals. The business could share their expectations for what the member of staff to be able to do, and train them so that if the key member of staff was to leave, a colleague could step in and take up the reins. Finally, contingency planning. Contingency planning is the process by which organizations try to prepare for unexpected and potentially disastrous events by developing alternative strategies. So kind of having a bit of a plan B. If something goes wrong, what is our contingency plan? This can be valuable to the business. It gives them a sense of security that we've planned what's going to happen. If anything goes wrong, we'll be okay. It can limit the damage of particular events, speed up the recovery process to a business if something goes wrong, and it can be a large part of staff training. What do we do to enact our contingency plan? However, it can be quite costly and time consuming. So the time people spend developing contingency plans and rehearsing them, could they have been spent that time actually doing something that will happen in reality, a kind of plan A, or running the business? They regularly need reviewing to make sure that they're still relevant, and it's hard to predict exactly which plans the business should be preparing. What are exactly the key risks? So we talked a lot about risk mitigation there and the sorts of things businesses might do to ensure they can deal with key risks. But one question the business must always ask itself is the risk mitigation actually worth it? The succession planning or the contingency planning, is it worth it? And to work that out, we really need to consider, well, what is the probability of the risk versus the financial impact? So for example, if it's got high probability, 5 out of 5 is going to happen, but actually the impact wouldn't be severe, then we're probably saying actually we would maybe just watch or just kind of deal with that risk. It's a green, it's not particularly significant. If it maybe has quite a high consequence, so a 4 out of 5, but it's got very little chance of happening, then again we might say, well, we're not going to mitigate that risk. we're just going to kind of watch it, let it happen. If we find that actually the significance is quite high, a 5 out of 5, and the probability is very high, 5 out of 5, then this is something we would call, a red risk, and we definitely need to mitigate that. Can we avoid it? Can we control it? Can we transfer it to someone else? So it's important businesses consider whether the risk mitigation is worth it. And this is often known as business impact analysis, performing this sort of assessment of the likelihood of a risk happening and the consequences or the financial impact of that risk. Some other things the business would need to consider is maybe the speed involved with the risk. How quickly will things go wrong? Will they have time to respond, or is it quite quick? And secondly, is something mission critical? And by that we mean, will it stop the business performing its key functions? That's obviously an important consideration for the business to take into account. So we've spoken about risk mitigation, the fact that businesses want to reduce or avoid risk. And there are 4 degrees to the extent to which they might go and try and achieve this. The first one is just to accept the risk. So if the cost of mitigation, the cost of implementing alternative strategy is greater than the cost of the risk may just have to be accepted. It's not really worth our while trying to avoid or minimize or mitigate this risk. We have to accept it, and that might be the kind of basic degree of risk mitigation. Second one would be risk avoidance. And that's quite an extreme risk mitigation. So it involves just, right, if there's any risk associated with this activity, we're just going to stop it. We're going to stop doing it. That is going to be a quite extreme degree of risk mitigation. The most common strategy perhaps is risk limitation. So reducing the risk but having some mitigation strategy in place. So we would try and quantify the risk and say, right, yep, there's a risk there, but these are the things we would do if it was to materialize. And the final one is actually to say, well, here's a risk that we can actually transfer to someone else. So we talked about IT systems earlier failing. That risk could be transferred potentially to a third party, an IT company whose responsibility is to back up your service, for example. So there are different degrees to risk mitigation, quite extreme ones where you don't mitigate at all, and extreme ones where you completely mitigate by not doing anything associated with that risk. The most common one is to try and limit the risk by having an alternative strategy in place, or perhaps the business might be able to transfer the risk to someone else. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by scenario planning. We've looked at the typical risks a business might face, and we've discussed different approaches, different strategies a business might use to reduce those risks. That's it. Thanks for listening.